Of course, the reason why this all matters is because millions of Americans are still dependent on additional federal level benefits here when we think about unemployment. Right now, that $600 addition per week is slated to roll off depending on what Republicans and Democrats can agree to in the next wave of aid here. And as we've heard from Republicans, it does sound like they are targeting a drop below that additional $600 worth of aid. So the question becomes, is that going to be enough for American families who are now out of work to weather the storm? And joining us now for more on that is Tamara Fucile, Center on Budget and Policy Priorities Senior Advisor, as well as a former worker at the Office of Management and Budget from 2014 to 2017. And Tamara, I appreciate you taking the time to chat with us. I know you were kind of the liaison and working with the Obama administration to get their budget proposals through. So what's your take right now on what we're hearing out of Washington, D.C. when we think about Republicans trying to cut potentially that additional blanket of aid when we think about unemployment, and whether or not that effect is going to be outstated here when we think about how much worse this could get?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It really is sort of a crazy time here in Washington as Republicans have struggled to figure out what their plan should be as they enter these final weeks for negotiations for this next coronavirus relief package. We had been expecting them to introduce their package this morning. That hasn't happened, and we understand that's largely because there is disagreement among Republicans about what the unemployment insurance compensation should be. Yesterday, Secretary Mnuchin seemed to signal that it would be around a 70% figure, which we know the UI, it's unclear what that means, but we think that it would be about a 2/3 cut in the $600 per week supplement. Right now, we know that, as Emily just reported, unemployment claims are rising. We're having, it's harder and harder for folks to find jobs as economies are starting to shut down again. The federal government has very few levers available to it to provide relief to the economy in this situation. Unemployment insurance benefits is one of the best. It gets money straight into people's hands. They spend it. It gets into the local businesses to help stop that downward spiral. If we're talking about going from a $600 to a $200 level benefit a week, that's a huge cut for households who we know are just barely hanging on.
Yeah, and when we think about the other things, too, that it sounds like Republicans are going to go without here, the president had been pushing for payroll taxes and cutting those. It doesn't sound like that's getting picked up from this proposal. The New York Times did have a readout pretty much of what it sounds like Republicans will be pushing for. Payroll taxes not on there, nor is aid for states, which is pretty interesting when we think about how much job losses have come from state and local governments as well here. But when we think about the other aspects of this, the Paycheck Protection Program also included here, when we think about what we've seen, not just in the unemployment update that we just got you, but yesterday also in the census survey showing that, again, the July jobs report could not only weaken, but possibly be negative when we think about the update that they gave us yesterday. I mean, the timing of this just seems like a bad idea to be cutting back on all of these things that have helped Americans struggling.
Absolutely. Data indicates that the Bipartisan CARES Act that was passed several months ago actually saved 12 to 16 million people across the country from falling into poverty. And as we are sort of in this uncertain time where it's unclear whether we'll continue to shut down, limiting aid is really the wrong direction to go. We know from the data that a huge number of people aren't able to pay rent. 1 in 5 adult renters actually fell behind or chose to take a deferment in rent, according to the most recent data. We know that millions of people, highest levels we've seen in decades, are struggling to eat and put food on the table. We think that that's about 11% of adults across the country are not able to have enough to put food on the table. So as we look at what is most effective in trying to help people really weather the economic consequences of this pandemic, getting that relief straight into people's hands is most effective. You mentioned, I believe, there's talk about doing another round of stimulus payments on the table. That relief certainly can help, but it's also not necessarily the best targeted. We know from the first round of stimulus that a lot of people who received it didn't spend that money. They just saved it because it wasn't going to the people who are actually being hit by the crisis. If we're talking about trying to be the smartest with this relief package, to focus our federal dollars on those mechanisms that actually have the highest impact, we want to move more towards those sort of direct payments that help those who are impacted directly.
Yeah, and as we highlighted yesterday, a lot of this might be tied to Americans not wanting to actually go out and spend. We've always been closely tracking the JP Morgan Chase credit card spend data. We've seen present card transactions there, effectively people actually spending at a location, whether it be a store or a restaurant, effectively been stalling since June, around the same time that we saw a lot of these coronavirus cases start to tick higher as well. So it's a question of, if you're out of work, you don't have money to spend, so you're going to try and save, as you're talking about, but also the health aspect of all this as well. But clearly a lot in flux. We'll see what they agree to. For the time being, it does sound like some benefits might be cut here. But Tamara Fucile, appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you.